Hi, my name is Steve Martin, and today I will be presenting a case study about a financial services firm that produces software for other businesses to use. So this will be a business-to-business software case study. Now, the interesting thing about this case is that it took over 15 months to do this particular transformation, and it was just the beginning of the transformation. So the case study that's written has a lot of information in it, including the success factors. But in this particular presentation, what I wanted to cover was a little bit more about how we got started, what was the reference model that we used, as well as two issues that we ran into, one from the Scrum Master cycle side of the Scrum at Scale model, as well as an issue that we didn't overcome from the product owner side of that cycle. And so you're probably thinking to yourself, 15 months, and we had only 7 teams come out of this? Wow, there were a lot of issues going into this company. First of all, there were some serious mandates that were coming through that were required by various government bodies. These were things that absolutely had to go in. At the same time, they also had their top 5 customers that were just pummeling them with a long list of enhancement requests. Now, since the mandates weren't being worked on, as well as the long list of enhancement requests not being worked on, we had some really unhappy customers. In fact, their number one customer that represented a very significant portion of their income was threatening to leave, and they were very public with this. And so when they started to look at things such as a long release cycle of well over a year and the low quality that was present when they released the software in the form of bugs, the previous release had over 80 bugs in it, things weren't looking so good. And so the CIO really had low confidence in their capabilities. But when the CIO contacted us and said, hey, we have some issues going on here, the folks that estimated the work just to do the compliance things, these are the managers estimating the work, that should be your first clue right there. They said it was about 18 or so months to do the work, and they had less than 9 months to get it done before those regulations went in. So things were a little stressful, I guess you could say, at this organization. Now, another interesting thing about this group is that this financial group had been around for quite some time. Many of the folks there had been there for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I was even there when somebody received their 40-year PIN. How many people get a 40-year PIN at one company these days? So that should tell you two things. Number one, the amount of inertia that we had to overcome in even introducing something new such as Scrum, in addition to just a completely complex, convoluted way that they deployed software and the way that they wrote the code. And so there were a lot of things that we needed to look at. So what we decided to do is not go for a big bang approach, and I really liked how we said, okay, why don't we take 2 teams, 1 product, 1 site. This organization had 4 sites. Let's not try to, boil the ocean. Let's just see if we can get that reference model to work for just 2 simple teams. And to help support those teams, we created an executive action team that had 2 C-levels, the CIO and the COO, plus around 4 to 6 or so managers that showed up and helped create the environment by which to make those first 2 Scrum teams successful. And they also had an Agile coach, that was there to help guide them through that process. And so what we really focused on was what were some of the things that we could learn before we scaled across other parts of the organization, and how can we get things rolling. And after about 3 to 5 sprints or so, those 2 teams, the velocity was looking good. We had 6 to 8 team members. We had a dedicated Scrum Master, dedicated product owner. Everybody was co-located, 2-week sprints, and they were actually doing working software every sprint. So things were looking really good. We said, hey, why don't we introduce some more teams? But we're not going to do it at the same site. Let's see what the culture is like at another site. So we went to product Y, a different product, 2 other teams at a different location. Now, when we went to that different location, what happened was it was a larger location with more management. More management meant more people on the executive action team. Pretty much all the managers wanted to be on this, in addition to the EVP of product. So our EAT ended up with just under 20 members. We're going to talk about why this is bad here shortly. Not recommended, by the way. Yeah, we've got 20 members, and the optimum was 4.6 people. Yeah, this was not 4 times more efficient. And so we had that, and what we wanted to learn here was, what was it going to look like for an organization to use some of these agile practices and Scrum at Scale patterns when we were to go to a much grander organization. And so once those teams, again, started to have stable velocity, doing things, 3 to 5 sprints, things were looking really good. And so what we did is we went to Product Z and we added 3 more teams. So now we have 7 teams total. And at this point in time, Executive Action Team, man, wow. What started off really good in phase 1, which was really values-based and principles-based, when we added all those folks and it was up to 20 members or so, they rolled back into what I would consider more of a governance model. And so they were managing, enforcing, trying to make everything consistent across every single team. That didn't work out so well. And so what we did instead is we broke out the Executive Action Team into truly executives on the action team. So we had the CIO, COO, and the EVP. And then we had kind of a scrum of Scrum Masters of a newly formed Agile practice. We took all those 15 managers and put them into an Agile practice. And we said, okay, what are some of the organizational issues that we're running into? And they fell generally into 3 categories. Technology. There were some serious technology issues. The second one was about the product and whether or not the product was actually meeting the needs. And the third one was about, how are we doing Scrum and how are we going to roll it out across the organization when we were done. And so they kind of self-organized into 3 little teams as part of that Agile practice. They had a backlog. And what we did is we had that Agile practice run in the same 2-week cadence as all the teams, and we had a common day for a sprint review. So product X would go, product Y would go, product Z would go, and then, the Agile practice would go. They would have to go up there and show what they did for the teams, because the teams were their customer, over the last 2 weeks. And so it brought a lot of that transparency in the things that they were doing at that point in time. It wasn't until then that the light bulb really went on if this is what we need to do as an organization to scale beyond just 7 teams. Now that last phase, phase 3, took roughly 8 months or so to really get through a lot of those cultural organizational issues. And then they decided after this that they wanted to do things on their own, and they added 8 more teams on their own without an Agile coach. But this is the approach that we used for the first 3 phases. The other interesting thing that happened was certain Agile coach missed a few words in the Scrum guide that said, Scrum of Scrums, for things that may be needed. I just read that as you should do a Scrum of Scrums with all the teams together. So I try to have product X, product Y, product Z all together in a Scrum of Scrums. Congratulations, it did not work. And so our lesson learned from that is, have those self-organized for the things that make sense where it organized. Unfortunately, when we did the Scrum of Scrums and we tried to put it in, it had such a negative taste in everybody's mouth that they didn't want to do Scrum of Scrums. That was like a verboten word or a verboten phrase. And so we said, how are we going to get cross-team collaboration if we're not going to do a Scrum of Scrums? Now, the nice thing is that since they were co-located and they have relatively good-sized teams, if they had an issue from team 1 to team 2, they literally were sitting next to each other. They just got up and went over, and they talked to the person. They didn't necessarily even wait till the daily Scrum. If they had an issue, they just resolved it. So it was really a self-organizing thing. Then we also noticed that most of the daily Scrums happened between 9:30 and 10:30 in the morning, and there was just like this natural exodus and a natural gathering of folks around the coffee. And so they would have those cross-team coordinations meetings there as well. Third, since the product were demonstrated as part of the sprint review as a product, not as teams, that also enforced some collaboration as well. They also did an Agile community of practice organized by the Scrum Masters. And lastly, the product owners and the chief product owners, which I'll show on the next slide, coordinated rather nicely. So that was the issue that we had from that Scrum Master cycle side of the thing. That was the issue that we ran into there. Now, from a product owner perspective, we are very fortunate, again, to have product owners for every single team that were dedicated. And on top of each one of those products, we also had a chief product owner, which typically came from the product management organization. And the way that we organized the backlog, since they were quite different in terms of what their products were, is they did have 3 different backlogs that they were working from. Where we had a challenge is in the executive meta scrum. I really enjoyed working with the EVP of product, but the EVP of product was getting hammered so heavily with the compliance issues and trying to solve those that they kind of lost their vision. They kind of lost their release planning. And that kind of impacted some of the other customer things that were coming down the pipeline. Now, the EVP did two actions that really helped the teams go a little bit faster. First of all, they invited participation from the actual customers as part of sprint reviews through what we call the user advisory group. So we got some real-time feedback as we were going along. Now, when it comes to compliance regulations and things like that, they're not very specific. They just say you have to do something. So there's some broad things that you can do there. And so what we were trying to do every 2 weeks was validate whether or not the solutions that we had were going to meet those compliance mandates. And the second thing that I really applauded the EVP for doing was he culled that 4 to 5 year old backlog. He just chopped it. Pretty much anything over 18 months was gone. And for the things that were remaining for that 18 months worth of work, they prioritized, and only the stuff at the top did they actually take a look at those stories and really validate whether or not those things were necessary. So they were really focused on doing the highest priority enhancement requests as we could potentially fold into some compliance work while we were there. Now, for some of the outcomes that we had, the really interesting thing is that the 18 months of estimated work by the management team was actually done in about 8 months by the team. So just almost the same amount of software and functionality that was needed in just about half the time. So we met the compliance date by the skin of our teeth, but we made it. High quality, much, much higher quality. Like I said earlier, the previous release had roughly 80 bugs. This release had 4 bugs that were, quote, accepted as features by the product owner. They were really insignificant. We also had the Agile practice work on several of the technical practices, and they introduced refactoring and some other techniques. And so instead of spending about 40% of the sprint time, about 4 days worth of the sprint time, on just trying to merge and do conflict merges, they started to do merges throughout the sprint. So typically we did one at the end of the first week, which was about day 5. We did another merge around day 8, and then we did a, quote, final merge on day 10. So we did multiple merges throughout. Wasn't quite daily, but we were kind of working in the right direction. And since we had user advisory groups working with us along the way, and they saw us working on solving the compliance issues and their highest priority enhancement requests, the client satisfaction went through the roof. People that were openly hostile to us were actually becoming our advocates out to other customers and actually introduced more work for us. So we had some very good successes from there. So again, the complete case study is available to you, written, and these are just some of the highlights from that particular case. Thank you.
Great. One question I have for you is for the 2 teams, 3 and 4, what were their sizes?
Those were 7 to 9, so just one more person than the first 2 teams that had 6 to 8.
So basically you had 18 people, let's say maximum on these 2 teams, and then 20 people on an executive action team.
Yes.
So you had basically a 1-to-1 ratio of people who are actually doing the work versus people who wanted to know what was going on and thought they could help solve the problem.
Absolutely, and that was one of the things I had to break.